the meeting, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So from the Independent Accountability Panel, I think I know most of you, Claire Petrie, the chair, Andrew from the Energy Users Association.
Wherever you're from.
Sorry, Andrew Richards. And Cassandra Goldie is joining us, but she's just not here at the moment, so she may just come in very soon, as well as Luke Brown, who's assisting us in the preparation of the report. This meeting will be recorded and put up on our website. I think, is that your understanding, Lynn?
Alex, just tell me the answer to that question.
Sorry, I was busy reading. Hold on. Oh, sorry.
So here's Luke Brown. Hello, Luke. It's just like all our public forums are up on the website. So we
that's fine.
would be happy about that as well.
Yep. Sorry, I just got distracted. A few people are using the old password, so I just sent them the new password.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, look, welcome everyone to this, from our point of view, really important meeting, given that the groups that the members of the EUCG represent. You know that we have met with, we've had the disclosures, we've met with all the CEOs, we've had a number of community forums, we've had a number of public submissions in what is a very tight timetable. And I know you raised that as an issue in the EUCG submission, and we can talk about that a bit later, because to be honest, I agree with you. But it's really important for us to hear from you. So essentially, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Lynn, to make some introductory comments, and then over to the committee to reinforce the issues that you've raised in your submission. So thanks, Lynn.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Chair and Andrew. Thanks for the opportunity again. I guess what I wanted to do is just give some prefacing remarks because I think you need to hear from the richness of the members of the EUCG, because not all of them have been able to put things in writing, and I think that's, so I want them to have as much of the floor today as possible. So I want to make first some observations, and then there's some recommendations. With some of this is recapping what's in our submission, but some of it has a bit more colour and movement maybe. So the first thing is to say that if there was a welcome shift this year, it's in the nature of the disclosures, and they're easier to comprehend, they're easier to assess, and frankly, they're probably much more targeted to the sort of meaningful outcomes for consumers. That's both a not surprising, but also a delight. So I just wanted to sort of say that at the outset. There's some real standout achievements amongst individual companies, and it's clear that a number of companies, though, have thought more deeply than others about how far they could go to deliver better outcomes for consumers. And so we're interested, I guess, how the IAP might want to handle calling out great practice. I think it's probably a little unfair to say last year everybody got a prize, but because the idea was to try and reinforce baseline and give everybody some comfort that they'd done something well as set the ambition. But I wonder this year whether it might be time to sort of really show who's out ahead of the pack and why. In view of the range of maturity scores, some very high out of 35, some probably unfairly hard marking themselves down, and others around the pass mark, I think we'd be interested perhaps in the panel's views, if not today, but it'd be good to understand how companies are arriving at their scores, because does reveal to an extent and a level of self-awareness amongst some and perhaps not others. And I think it's an important development to have this kind of self-rating and see how people have set their ambition. One of the observations I think we make is almost the companies that have now understood and engaged more deeply with their consumers are actually setting them, even possibly marking themselves down, because they can now see the size of the task. So that's really just an observation, but no particular dig at anyone. We're also looking at how the Energy Charter delivers as its entirety, so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Many of the people on this call may share with you that they have very positive views about what happened with bushfires and joined up responses and first line responders and coordination amongst first line responders, whether they were networks or retailers or working with government, but really not so great feeling about the COVID response. If anything, and perhaps the fairest way to express the disappointment, and others will amplify from their own perspective, is that it isn't really evident there was a cultural shift, or that there's a shift in understanding this is a very unusual environment, very unusual times, and there seemed to be a lot of defensiveness around the current business model and why that is the business model, and that was getting in the way of the kind of empathetic whole of customer, whole of circumstance view. So I think that's something that we'd like to other people might comment on. And it'd also be fair to say that it's hard to see the impact of the Better Together initiatives, where they fit in. The impact hasn't necessarily been clear. In terms of recommendations, and I'm going to stop soon, we've really put 4 recommendations, again, not surprising because of the importance and the ongoing importance of dealing with consumers in vulnerable circumstances. And I use those words deliberately because we also have small business now finding themselves in vulnerable circumstances. We really see the need for a joined up response, and so we've proposed a task force, but no detail on that necessarily, but a way of working together with the CEOs, the CEO Council, to actually address those issues. All customers on hardship or assistance or payment plans, whatever, or a COVID response plan, should automatically be being put on the cheapest offer. If you're already case managing them around their inability to pay bills, actually having them on an offer or a retail offer plan that's actually costing them more money than they need to be spending seems a bit futile. More proactive responses around heading off people in vulnerability. That may be communication, maybe a range of things, and adherence to no disconnections. I think that's important. It's been disappointing to see that a number of companies have been fined recently for not even meeting the minimum requirements. I'm just going to go off reservation for a minute. I raised yesterday life support as an issue, personal issue for me. And the comment was, well, that's just a bare minimum. That's a regulatory requirement. That's not an ambition. But again, I think that's where we're disappointed when we see people being disconnected who shouldn't have been under the rules. That seems really inconsistent with the ambition of the Energy Charter. So I'm going to stop there. And Alex, if you can just still keep seeing if people are struggling to get in and manage that, that'd be great. And I'll hand over to anyone who, through you, Chair, wants to take the floor.
And thanks, Lynn. And can I just note that Cassandra Goldie, CEO of ACOS, has just joined us, and Luke Brown as well, who's helping us with the report.
So I'll let people put their hand up if you can see their hands, or
yes, right. Well, okay. Well, I'll take it from here if people just want to put up their hand and make a comment on the report or anything else that's occurred to you subsequently. Now, I know I'm looking at people who are not short of
They
comments.
might feel I've been entirely comprehensive, though.
They might, but I
Yes.
doubt it.
But I guess I'm inviting people to add really some detail and you know the richness of their thinking. So I'm thinking,
Claire, I'm happy to dive in actually. Hello everybody. Hi Lynn, good to see you. And Gavin, Dean and others. Can I pick up on the recommendation around the task force and just plot that out further? I think all of us, and you'll have heard from the meetings that we've had with the CEOs, you know, we really wanted to drill down into the nature and scale and extent of what's actually been planned and, you know, getting in place to really tackle emerging serious risks in terms of vulnerability, existing and further to come. So Lynn, it'd be great to hear how you see that working in amongst other, you know, mechanisms that are happening and the particular value you think that task force would bring to this accelerating the changes we think are needed.
I'm going to, what's the right word? I'll let people chime in and confirm if I've got the sense of it right, and Alex, if I miss any sort of detail. I guess the early days of the pandemic revealed that there was a lot of conversation and a lot of words and a lot of meetings. And there's a sense of disappointment that it didn't really seem to change the overall response. And I'm also going to be a bit blunt. One of the fundamental things that a number of people have expressed, sometimes forcefully, but other times much more politely, is the idea that you need to threaten customers to pay their bill or threaten them with disconnection to pay their bill. Seems a bit anathema at a time when we have the kind of scale of the problem we have. And that there are other approaches which are getting in earlier, communicating earlier, finding if your communication's not landing. So it's both, I guess, a commitment to action, and while the action probably to date has been around disconnection, there is a belief, and it's starting to show up, that, you know, people are going to have some kind of debt overhang or debt cliff. So the task force is really a proposal to say, let's commit to the action and then solve the problem or the ways of doing it. So that's hence why it was expressed as a need to have a sort of joined up response, a task force that includes both consumers and people with accountabilities, frankly, in the energy businesses. And I don't exclude anyone from the supply chain. I mean, that's the point. It's useful to have networks and retailers in that group discussing the issues, so that we don't end up where we ended up midway through the year as well, with networks and retailers pointing fingers at each other about how dare networks have gone out with a package, or networks didn't do the package the right way, or nobody told anyone anything about anything. And it just seemed the usual, just too much business as usual. So let's get past that, having learnt this year, and again, this is an extraordinary year with people working from home, people in energy businesses working from home, call centres all over the place being closed. So I don't underestimate the challenge, but having learnt the challenges, let's find a way forward. And I guess I'm really saying it has to be led from the top, from CEOs.
It's interesting. The impression that I've got is that we've talked a lot about this sort of looming debt tsunami and looming crisis that's coming, and that this year in some ways hasn't been as bad as we thought, and next year is probably going to be worse than we think.
Yeah.
And there seems to be an awareness but no preparedness for what may be coming. And that's quite concerning. I think maybe, again, this is just the impression I get, that they're hoping it goes away. They're hoping the economy bounces back really quickly. They're hoping that jobs return really quickly and money's in people's pockets, and that I know the Victorian government's looking at putting in place a $250 rebate system to help clear debt, those sorts of things. So I think, yeah, there's an awareness but not a preparedness, and I think which is astonishing given what we've gone through this year. Do you think, and I'm really interested in your entire supply chain or value chain proposition, Lynn, because you're right, there was that discussion around between retailers' networks around maybe sharing some of that risk. So to me, that seems to be there's a bargain, or there needs to be a broader coalition that of governments, retailers, networks, generators, all sharing some of that load. Is that something that should be considered, do you think?
Yeah, I think yes to that. So first of all, underline your absolute assessment, or your assessment in full agreement with your assistant of a lack of a plan. If anything, we've consistently had no plan through the year, and we kept waiting. I'm now sort of speaking for ECA, I suppose. We kept expecting one. So yes, absolutely, there needs to be a plan, and wishing and hoping is not a plan. And if we have a plan and it all turns out not to be as bad as we think, well, hooray, that's great, happy days. I do agree around the risk sharing. I think it's a liquidity, I'm an economist, so excuse me, and I've lived through the GFC. It's a liquidity problem. We've taken income and earnings out of the economy, right? It's not just energy companies that are suffering pain. And if I hear one more energy company of any stripe or any part of the supply chain tell me how their income has been affected this year, I agree. But you're a corporation, right? There are people out there with real world problems, and it's a community responsibility, right? If you do not, and any of us who've lived through a recession know, you do not want people ending up in the worst of all kind of possible places. You've got to not let the floor, fall out of, fall far. You've got to keep people healthy and functioning, and energy is critical in that environment. So I understand this has been challenging for corporations, but imagine what it's like for people who have never been in hardship before, who have never had difficulty paying their bills, and all of a sudden, highly geared, everything else, shame, struggling to know who to talk to, managing all that kind of stuff, etc. So that's one piece. The second piece is, again, things possibly went better in this space, which was about sort of shared communication. Networks don't have brands, but they do have ways of reaching their customers. And really just build on that and amplify that as well, and bring the generators in too, because they may have ways of reaching their communities, right? And ensuring people know there's help. So the old model of, again, it's your responsibility to, get help from your retailer. And we are seeing people disconnected, with the retailer saying, well, they didn't contact us. Well, there's 1,000 reasons why people may not have contacted you, or they may have sat on the phone for an hour. So again, enlisting everyone, right? Because no one is unaffected, right? Pretty much we all know somebody, and everyone in those businesses knows somebody who's struggling in some way, right? Economically, emotionally, psychologically. So let's mobilize the fact that, these corporations are made up of humans as well. And let's, decide we're going to actually mobilize that. And the companies who did that this year were people who actually asked their employees and listened to their employees, and not their marketers, about what kinds of things to do to help people. And it's a little bit off topic, but one company hired an Indigenous corporation to make masks, which they then distributed to healthcare workers and older vulnerable people in the community for free. There's all kinds of ways. So I guess we're sort of saying it just seemed to fall back into the who pays and who's benefiting, and you should take my risk and I shouldn't be taking your risk. And it was just very frustrating as consumer groups to sit around listening to that. Anyway, I've dominated the conversation. I'm sure, Kelly, now that you're on, or Gavin might want to add a few things. Kelly, did you want to jump in?
Maybe go to Gavin first and then I can jump in. I'm conscious that I missed the beginning as well. So
It's all right. Start wherever you want to start.
okay, but Gav, you go first.
Okay, thanks for that bus that's just run over me. No, look, I agree with everything that Lynn say. I think it's about how you frame responses up here to keep them in for the long game, as Andrew has lifted up. I mean, you've got the COVID thing, the corporate knowledge. Nobody remembers last time we were here, other than a few of us. So they're relearning a whole lot of things. So there's an opportunity here as well, because it is front of mind. And I think for me, it's about how do you craft the response back that gets them to lean into it and embed it in over the next year or 2 years. And say this is not just because COVID numbers are zero, the problem is getting worse and it's around the corner. And I think that provides us with an opportunity to get a whole lot of culture change in there. I also think that I worry that Origin has left. So the thing is, how do you keep them in the tent, but put the screws on them, and then slowly get that culture change? So it's like, yeah, slowly boil a frog is what I'm thinking. And I agree with what Lynn said. I mean, some, having had a chat to a few of them, some were being quite grandiose in their assessments. And I think it was good to get them to temper back. I think that they were, just a comment, I think they were playing to their senior executive to talk themselves up to the senior executive. So, well, why would you do that? Talk yourself down. You need more resources to do this stuff to get a proper mark. You need to say it how it is. So I think there's a conversation there's an opportunity within there to support the people inside the company to tell it as it is, which then appeals to the senior executive to say, well, look, to do this properly, resources do need to be allocated and we do need to focus on it. So just in summary, I think it's about how you play the long game here. And there's an opportunity here because of the unique 1 in 100 years environment that we're in, and how do we build on that?
Do you think not all, but some of them see it as another compliance task rather than a change sort of, and that more customer centricity is actually good for their long-term business, and rather than just seeing it as another yoke around their neck?
I think it's two things. I do, Andrew, because I think that if they don't do it well, they get penalised internally. It's not so much the external conversation, because we're a little bit more on the journey. That's good. This is bad. It's a little bit more fuller. The conversation when they talk to consumer is a fuller conversation. Nobody's perfect, but we're all here. But when it's internal, it becomes KPI driven, which is very, you're either pass or you don't. So I think it's how you manage, or how you craft a conversation that says that gets a bit more freedom within those internal KPIs. So it's not tick and flick, and where you can craft a conversation internally that gets into the qualitative nature of it all, which is where the gold is in this. It's not disconnections are zero. Well, I can do that just by not disconnecting, but it's actually the conversations that you have with people as to why you didn't disconnect. That's where you get the relationship building and the depth of improved customer service and everything else. Anyway, I've banged on too much. That's my only feedback.
Kelly, did you want to then say something?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's been an interesting conversation, and I think when ACOS was doing our submission, I sort of looked at the disclosures and sort of considered their response to the crisis that we had experienced. And as you would have seen in our submission, I think they did well around the bushfires, less well around COVID. And, it really was COVID that there was that was their opportunity to shine, really. I mean, this is the whole point of the charter, is best practice and coming together as an industry and saying, you know, we're going to do the best for customers in the community. And for many of us, they just failed on that in the beginning. But I guess I'll come back to that, but one observation is that I then went back and looked at all the recommendations we made last year, and a lot of them reflected what the EUCG had also made. So, you know, we sort of replicated our recommendations, and ACOS had some additional. And I sort of then went back and looked at progress that they had made on against a lot of those recommendations. And I was actually surprised that, you know, they have done, going back and looking at their disclosures, they had started addressing quite a few of those recommendations. So, you know, in our submission, you can see where we've said partial to that. And, you know, there was some effort made in understanding the consumer better, although I think in Robin's submission around COTA, she makes a really good point that it's still not understanding the variability of customer is something that I think they need to focus a bit more on. So you can see there's effort being made there, and, you know, dedicated staff and a culture change starting to happen. But, you know, just going back to the response around COVID, they absolutely could have stepped up and said, we as an energy charter are going to work with consumers and look at what we can do, and then put that to the industry associations. Instead, they chose to stand back and say, we'll leave it up to the industry associations to come up with a response, which the industry associations themselves didn't quite fulfill. It really wasn't until the AER came out and said, this is our expectation, that we saw a shift. And that, you know, some of what the Energy Charter members did was then, you know, tinker around the edges. So, you know, for me, that was the big disappointment, that in a time of crisis, they actually didn't step up. And for me, it's the whole premise of the charter is doing that.
Kelly, COVID aside, where do you think our expectations as users should sit? Are we expecting too much too quickly, or are we being too harsh? I mean, what are we clear about what our expectations are of them and the trajectory we think they should be on? And are they on that, COVID aside?
No, I don't think we're being too harsh. I mean, these are, as Lynn was saying, they're big corporations. You know, they've got the finances to be able, and the whereabouts. They've been playing in this space long enough. They've been talking to consumer groups for long enough about what is needed. And, you know, we've pushed back numerous times around hardship policy and disconnections and that sort of, that conversation has been ongoing for quite some time. And, you know, people like Gavin, and I noticed Douglas isn't here, and Patrick can attest to those conversations. So
just on that, I'll just expand on that from Kelly as well, right? I mean, last year what we did, and thank you, Ross, for your comment as well. Last year, what we did is go, here's the ambition and let's establish a baseline, right? And we did say, based on their disclosures, that the baseline was pretty low, right? But we said, well, everybody has to start from somewhere, right? So then when we met again with the CEO Council and in various forums with the people that have been delegated within these businesses to carry this forward, we said, you know, see that gap as an ambition and an opportunity to close the gap and as a challenge. Go above compliance, go to really thinking about how you can make a difference. We're not going to tell you what to make a difference in, and I suppose COVID was not a big distraction, but you know, I don't mean it in that sense, but you could sort of go, leave that as we're just saying here. I guess we said, you know, challenge yourselves, right? Because otherwise, why have you got a charter if all you're doing is going to give yourself a tick? And there was, and this is a little unfair to this idea, but there was a comment made, well, how about we publish our net promoter scores? And we said, no, what we really want to see is what action you've taken, how you've had an impact for your customers. If you want to publish your Net Promoter Scores, that's fine. But that isn't really what the premise of the Charter's ambition is. It was to go, where are you? How customer-centric do you think you are? And so, no, I don't think we've necessarily been a hard marker. I think just the thing I did say to the CEO Council is the hurdle bar's probably gone higher with COVID. I'd accept that, but I do think we've probably been pretty careful. What we want to see is progression, and we've seen it in individual companies. We've seen it less so as the Charter.
Lynn and Kelly, if I could just pick up, if that's okay, Claire, on this bit about, I think there is a significant enthusiasm in moving from conversations and messages around a journey, being very specific about particular actions that are considered to be within the power and control of the signatories, which are entirely achievable to deliver and which you can specifically recommend as urgent actions to be delivered within a specific time frame to address vulnerability.
Yeah.
I think there is a compelling case for that. And there are some signatories where some of those measures have been taken, and in the spirit of the Charter, it is meant to be a process that's designed around leadership. And so this is a really great opportunity for you to bring through what exactly and specifically those measures are that you would want to see the panel back in.
Yeah. Well, I think we've probably listed a few, and I know Kelly individually has a few more which go to more specifics.
Yeah.
But certainly, if you're, as we said, if you're on any form of payment plan, you know, there's been a lot of semantics, right? About, oh, you're on payment plans, or you're on hardship, or you're on some COVID plan or whatever. Anybody who's being assisted should be case managed, right? Just case manage them, right? So you're not paying whatever however you are being billed, you're paying the cheapest rate, right? Now that might require, you know, a deeper conversation with the customer, but you're already case managed. You should be case managing them. You should not be credit department managing them, right? So I think in that, then there's, I'll give an example, and again, I'm conscious it's being recorded, so I'm not going to use the name, but they will know who I'm talking about. It was both positive but also frustrating. You know, one company in their customer council said we had 175,000 or 17,000 customers on special arrangements, deferral. And as we were getting closer to the time, we wrote to them and said, please get in touch with us because your special arrangement is coming to an end, and we need to work out whether we're going to continue or make a different arrangement for you. And I can't remember the exact number, but it was in the hundreds of people responded. That was the end of the conversation in that room. They went, oh, well, we'll write to them again. Well, you know, Andrew's comment earlier about a plan. Well, if it's not working, what is, that's it? Or it was a bit like, you know, what do we do when we've done everything we can do? Well, I'm not sure you have, right? I mean, you had 17,500 known people who you needed to make arrangements for, and you just left it.
And I think that goes to the EUCG submission, Lynn, that talks about communication can't be just the bill, and it has to be customer driven, not the company driven. And in terms of segmenting customers and aren't really responding to their needs, the way they want to communicate is part of that.
Exactly. And watching a network business challenge itself, how it was going to communicate with customers. So we had one of the biggest retail companies with millions of customers with however many employees saying, this is too challenging, I can't manage it. and that's probably unfair, so I should rephrase that. Not sure, unsure about what to do next is probably a better way of characterising it. With a network company, actively thinking, do I SMS people? Do I call people? Do I write to people? Or do I do all three? And actually asking people on their customer council to test ideas and workshop them and co-design them. So,
Dean, was it Dean? Yep.
Yeah, it is, Dean. And I should preface what I'm going to say by, like, I've been out of this group for a few months, so I'm a bit, I've got something in my head a bit. Sorry for that. There was a bit of a mix up with email lists. I've also been very disconnected, I guess, from vulnerable customer issues for about the last 4.5 years since I left FECOS. It's remarkable. It's a bit remarkable to hear the same conversations and the same issues still. I actually really think that that example that Lynn just gave goes to one of the hearts of it that I see, which is that I'm going to generalize, and there are exceptions and there are good exceptions, but yeah. I feel like retailers still tend to see hardship as an individual problem rather than as one of the external factors that impacts on their business. I guess I'll say non-payment rather than hardship. There's all these external factors that network businesses, that retail businesses need to deal with, whether it's, price spikes or, outages or natural disasters or whatever. There's all these things that they need to account for. And I think when networks are contacting customers about outages and making sure they're getting in touch, they're not thinking of it as an individual problem, but we need to deal with this issue that affects a proportion of our customers. And I sort of feel like that seems to be the direction that retailers need to move into as well. And I think that COVID has actually shone a light on a thing that a lot of us have known for a long time, but that has been tenaciously invisible to a lot of people, which is that energy hardship is not about energy, but it's about broader hardship and vulnerability. And we were just talking about this in a meeting I was in yesterday as well. And it's like, that's really true. And as long as it's seen as an energy problem, you're not going to see the whole problem. It needs an energy solution.
Pick up on that, because I think observation is that, of course, there are externalities for an individual or a household that affect your capacity to manage your bill, all those things that are not necessarily within the remit of an energy company to change. But it's the bit about what's the responsibility for the company.
That's what I'm
in the context of that, and being really specific about, those particular measures. Yeah.
And I feel like some of the businesses are grasping that more than others, especially this last 6 months. And I guess I see that's the value of like a task force, a sort of formal sort of group, engaging them on the issues, because I think that's the best chance to move the understanding to that next deep level, to like, we have a critical role in dealing with this thing that's actually a broader issue, but that impacts us a certain way. And I actually think we started heading there like several years ago, just before the EUAA amalgamated with whoever else it was, I've forgotten their name. There was this whole like retailer-based hardship initiative that was really collaborative. It was in some ways a bit of a precursor to some of the stuff the energy charters tried to do on a smaller scale. And that was actually feeling like we're moving in a very positive direction towards getting whole of industry change understandings and new approaches on some of these issues, and sort of external factors sort of stop that process a bit. And I feel like this is a really good opportunity to do something similar on this sort of bigger sort of scale.
I can probably give some additional examples, Cass. And look, I just want to thank everyone that puts input into the ACOS submission. So, this is an absolute team effort. And it's also some on the basis of work that PIAC are leading along with a whole range of organisations through the roundtable, so that, COTA and Vinnie's and SACOS and Renew and others input into it. But, a classic example is we saw that regulation was put in last year around conditional discounts because we were seeing the impact on people, especially people on low income who couldn't meet those conditions and then suddenly ended up with a way more expensive bill. So it's good those regulations are in place, but apparently there's a whole lot of people still sitting on these conditional discounts, and retailers are saying they're still sitting there because, they haven't contacted us to get off these, you know, these tariffs, and so we, or that we've tried to reach out to them but we're not hearing from them. Well, AGL actually wrote to the AER and asked them to suspend the rules about needing customer consent, and just took all of their customers off those discounts and put them on the best offer. So, you know, that's an example where a retailer has gone, we can't reach customers for whatever reason it is, we're just going to put them on the best offer, and get the regulator's permission to do that. All retailers should be doing that. Yeah. So that's an easy thing to actually to do. The other one is around disconnections. I mean, we're all saying that there should be no disconnections while COVID's still on, and there should be a different way of engaging with consumers around disconnections. And I know the group are working on policy response, but, you know, I think, and Ross might want to talk to this, because what's happening in South Australia is that SAPAN is actually offering a service of doing face-to-face, going out to customers around disconnections, and that program is reducing disconnections by at least 50%. Ross, I think you might want to talk to that, but that's an amazing outcome. And, you know, some of the energy charter companies have taken up that offer in South Australia, but not all energy charter members are doing it, which is, you know, a bit perplexing, and that should be rolled out nationally. We should be having the energy charter retailers and networks working together and saying, let's roll this out, you know, nationally. So there's examples of good practice that could be being done immediately. Ross, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I think you've done well, Kelly. I think but the reality is that as we move into a smart meter environment, you can switch a smart meter off from a computer any bloody where. And so, in fact, that's creating enormous vulnerability for all of those households that are actually being disconnected because they can't afford to pay. And of course, in the midst of COVID, we've got a whole sort of other additional group of vulnerable households that might be in that situation. So this service, we ought to be working towards a mandatory kind of service. But you would think that if the energy charter companies were really interested, particularly the retailers that are involved, but all of the companies, if they were really interested in looking after the interests of their customers, they'd be providing this kind of leadership to the rest of the energy sector, demonstrating good practice, best practice, better practice, whatever you want to call it, and implementing it because they know it's good for the customers. And then
that's the personal contact at the heart of it, is it?
Yeah. I mean, that's for years, you know, anytime I went and did radio about, you know, disconnections, I would have linesmen from SAPAN ringing me up and saying, oh, but we're involved in doing those disconnections, and we find all sorts of excuses why not to disconnect people when we get to people's homes and find that they're really in difficulty, or it's a young mum with a family of 3 kids, or whatever it is. So there was the human contact. I guess this from SAPAN, this service is really them offering an additional extension of that at one level, where people go out, make deliberate contact, ensure, you know, check where people are up to. And in lots of instances, people have just disengaged. And that's what happens. We know that that's what happens to customers. Yeah. And so by engaging with them, they're able to draw them back in. And indeed, in many instances, it results, well, at least 50% of the disconnections don't proceed.
Be interesting to see, and not wanting to be cold-hearted about this, but the NPV for the company of doing that. It seems like if you're actually getting better collections and not disconnecting and not creating a bad debt and all the issues that go with that, then the NPV of actually doing this is positive.
Exactly.
And I think that's the work that needs to be done. But it should be the work that's being done by these energy charter companies at one level, because they can see the opportunity, but it's also really good practice.
I'd just like to follow on Ross's point too about smart meters. And again, what we had is the AER setting their statement of expectations. We had ESCV having a similar thing. But what we did see, and again, I'm just going to be careful, but for a time, and it was a longish time, the disconnections did not stop in Victoria, because all you had to do was put through the paperwork for the network to actually remotely disconnect. And it's why both ESCV and the AR has had to actually insist that if the individual subsequently contacts the retailer, that they're to be re-energised, reconnected, and the fees waived. And companies were doing that, were Energy Charter signatories. So again, it's a bit like being a bit late to recognise, what was actually going on. I just want to pivot off that though to a slightly different point, and this is not my area, and maybe Patrick can expand on this, but also again, one of the things we saw is the difference in the way energy concessions are delivered. So it is true that some state governments were able to pretty quickly automatically give people $50, $200, whatever it was, whatever they announced early, off people's bills. And it was a way of getting relief out, and it got it out quickly. It wasn't necessarily costless, wasn't necessarily easy, but they did it. What we've got is in some states, and I understand Victoria's one, where the conversion rate of the money they're given to the assistance that goes out to the people who are eligible for it is not flowing. So why are the energy concessions not flowing now? It just seems weird. So again, I think we're unpacking a few particular things, which I guess what I would say is, and again, my smart meter point is the same thing. What it's revealed is cracks in the system and cracks in the business models that basically say exactly, this is an individual problem, it's a credit problem, it's a customer credit problem, and it's not a broader, broader issue about assisting people. And that's a mentality that I'd like to see changed. Because otherwise, if that's ingrained, then how are you actually going to move past these examples of things go wrong?
Thanks, Lynn. We're rapidly running out of time. Did any of you who haven't spoken like to say something or other comments? Robin, yes, I thought you might like to say something.
Thanks, Claire. And I just want to mention that our Coda Energy Advocates have provided you with a submission on the disclosure statements. It came in late. I think there was a bit of a hiccup in getting through to you, but hopefully you have it now, or we'll see it soon.
We do.
One of the things that we have been speaking of really is calling out good practice or better practice. And I recall a recent conversation we had with Ben Wilson where he said, what we want you to do is to challenge the signatories to raise all boats, and that's going to be better for everybody. And I think that's part of our role, is to encourage all of the businesses to take on board these examples of better practice. And that's what we've been talking about in a number of instances. So I think that's going to be pretty fundamental to the challenge that we want to put back to the Charter signatories, to say, well, here's a whole series of possibilities that have been identified where you can lift your game. What's the hold up? And I can't see any excuses for not doing that. The second point, and I'm trying to avoid COVID because everybody else is speaking of COVID, so I'll go down a different path. It's really apparent to me that the signatories consider vulnerability and financial hardship to be almost one and the same, and that they are overlooking other types of vulnerability for customers. And not even considering people on life support as being vulnerable customers, which is quite astounding, really. And so their approaches to vulnerability, I just don't think are going far enough. I certainly wholeheartedly support anything they're doing to assist customers in financial hardship, but equally they need to be doing other things in terms of customers who are on life support, customers who are digitally excluded, customers who have disabilities, customers who are from a called background, Indigenous customers, all of those other aspects of their customer cohorts that also experience difficulties and challenges. So I think that's an area for improvement and reconsideration in the next cycle. And that brings me to my third point, and I just can't get over this timing issue again. And I'll raise it once more. I know we've had such a limited time to assess the disclosures and all the material this time round, but look, here it is, almost December. The next lot of disclosure statements are due in a couple of months. There's really no time for that feedback loop for us to have any influence on the signatories' programs for this financial year. And I just think we've got the whole cycle out of kilter. I'll stop there. I don't want to get on my hobby horse anymore. Thank you.
Just on that, Robin, there's no time to go into it now, but certainly from my point of view as a new chair, I want us to do this whole process has obviously evolved every year, and we will do a post-mortem on this year's experience. And so there will be factors we're looking at in terms of including the timetable, I think, and the feedback loops.
Robin, can I thank you also, of course, for introducing some of those other issues and in this meeting. This one about the clarity and some shared view about the attributions that are associated with vulnerability is it's an ongoing issue. It's been discussed a lot. Of course, when you don't settle on something as a kind of a shared set of attributes, it allows for a debate to happen, to continue, for questions, for a discussion, rather than going, we know at a minimum, these are particular attributes that should indicate vulnerability, and therefore we're agreed on it. There is a capability in signatories to track indicators, the metrics, to give the early alert about people who are likely to have some vulnerability, and then to be engaging. So this first bit of getting that shared view of the attributes associated with vulnerability, to what extent amongst this group do you think that is well settled? There is no debate. We just need the signatories to adopt our view. Or to what extent do you think there is still a need for more process in order to settle on what vulnerability actually is, and what therefore systemically should be embedded within corporation and signatory processes to identify and then engage with those consumers?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think we as a consumer group with hands on our hearts can put a piece of paper on the table and say, that's our view of vulnerability. We don't have it formally. I think we do have a shared understanding of what it is. We just haven't committed to that formally. And perhaps that's something we should take on board.
I might actually sort of point to the good work Claire did with ACOS in whenever it was, Claire, 2012, 13. I mean, there was a lot of discussion then. There's a lot of, and there's been a lot of reports. I think it would be good to write it down. Yeah. What is driving me a bit insane, and it's just a personal view, sorry. But, you know, there's a whole process coming out of Finkel where people, again, want to redefine vulnerability and have models of vulnerability. I mean, ESCV did it for their payment difficulties framework. Commonwealth's doing it for Finkel. A bit like you, Cassandra, I'd like to move move past? Can we just stop keeping defining it and making sure we've got the list comprehensive and write it down and agree it?
I'd recommend the AER commissioned work a year or so ago that was done by CPRC. It was very good. That's the best piece of work I've seen, and that's what I go back to. Yeah.
Yep. So we could, pick that and go. And then what I'd invite my small business colleagues as well too, because if there's one area I guess we hadn't, I still like to think about consumers in vulnerable circumstances rather than, vulnerable consumers. And we need possibly a whole awareness as well about the different challenges that small business owners and small operators and their families too, how they're being exposed to vulnerable circumstances in a way they've not had before. So, I'm happy to work with Simon and Tennant and others and Emily and to try and pull something together there.
Gavin.
I think we might be lifting up the wrong thing here, in my personal view, and I'm putting a reflection on working in an organisation that does service delivery. I think by classifying vulnerability, you end up predetermining outcome. Who gets it becomes a targeted thing. And with that, a focus goes in a particular place. For me, I think what you want to be doing is lifting up what processes they have put in place internally, so the staff are trained to be responsive to vulnerabilities, whatever they are, that they are trained and supported to and have the resources to meet whatever those vulnerabilities are. So it's about lifting up internally what has the company done to better do that. And a perfect thing in COVID is all the call centres coming back from overseas. All of a sudden the conversation became a lot easier and they've kept them here because the outcome was better. Because once you start to get down into binaries, we talk about disconnections or we talk about vulnerabilities, they'll say, well, so it's no disconnections, or what do we do? So they get into the process of it. They're engineering companies after all. So they try and engineer an outcome, whereas we're trying to turn them into social service companies, which is about how you interact with people, and do the people that you've got there, are they the right people, and are they resourced and supported, and do they have the tools, which is a very different conversation. So I think, and we assume that is going on internally, and it's not.
Taking that further, Gav, what about, a quick response to those moving into vulnerable circumstances? What about having better predictive capability and seeing early warning signs?
Definitely. We do the same thing in my organisation here. I'm trying to read my call centre about where the green shoots or the dead branches are coming from. And do we have the right people at the right place? So we've been shifting people around. We've done things where people that, our people that are delivering the service are vulnerable. We take them out of delivering the service because you can't have vulnerable people supporting vulnerable people. You just create more vulnerable people, particularly in your staff. So lifting up those conversations about how they're managing human resources, which are really, really critical in achieving outcomes, customer outcomes, I think might be able to recraft the conversation, one around a disconnection outcome, which is a regulatory outcome, but around a process. How do you do these things better, and how do you have humans to humans? Ultimately, I think that will give you the better outcome at disconnections or vulnerability or whatever it is. But that's how human services try and improve their service delivery, because everybody's unique and every situation's unique. So you work on skills and resources, and how do you allocate them the best you possibly can? And we're still shocking at it, but we keep trying.
And I guess I just reinforce that as well by saying one of the things that's still most confusing, is the best way I can put it to me, is how is it possible that no more people are being helped this year than last year with managing their bill in various programs? The AER data seems to suggest nothing's changed.
Well, I could say, I know in my organisation we're down 80% on the numbers of people presenting at the moment.
Yeah.
But only 40% on the dollar value of assistance. So the people that are coming are in a hell of a horrible place, but there's less of them at the moment. Now that will change, I believe, and Cass and everybody else, Sandra and everybody else will be nodding. But having that responsiveness, and we've crafted new services to meet new groups like the overseas students, and had to do it in particular ways. So we've had to meet need in different ways and reorganise resources to fit the situation.
Yeah.
And I think in the charter, if we can lift up, well, what have you done to meet the change, and how did you do it? And the attempt is a good thing to do, and rewarding that agility, I think, is useful. But people that just said, oh, we're going to do more of the same, but we'll employ 10 more people to do more of the same, that's not a good outcome.
I actually think those stats actually show the broader dimensions of the problem, because it's a whole social issue. What else has happened? You know, rents have been they're frozen, and statutory payments have gone up, and banks are giving people mortgage holidays. All these other pressures are out there, and it's actually easier for some vulnerable people to pay their electricity bills because of that. And that is, I think, yeah, it's going to wash out as that other stuff starts to change back to the old normal. That's when it's going to come back. And I think that's when, that is when we're going to see.
I mean, Cass, what did you say a few months ago? We'd solved poverty there for a while.
We did. We had a GMI, like working on them back in the late 80s, guaranteed minimum income. Awesome.
Raise the rate.
It disappeared quickly.
It circles back to some of the comments we were making before around being aware but not prepared. I think they all understand once all these social safety nets get pulled away, then people start hitting the ground pretty hard.
And that's when they need to have the right people at the right place with the right listening ears on, and all the tools all lined up for them to allocate them as best they can. And there will still be harm at the end, because we won't solve poverty. But you want to see those organisations that are, using their human resources really strategically and smart.
Yeah.
And you might actually have the last word, because we're running out of time, I'm afraid. So over to you.
Just very quickly then, I wonder then if, just taking it a bit higher on that, and on that point that Gavin just made about needing the right people in the right place doing the right thing, if we think about how the companies have rated themselves, and there seems to be a really different level of understanding of where they're at internally, based on how all of the energy user groups and consumer groups have viewed that. If you've rated yourself highly, do you therefore think you don't need to do anything more? Do you think you're in a really good place to respond, and is that potentially going to be a worse outcome? So how do we help companies to be more self-aware? Is there I don't know how you do that.
Yeah, but it's the right question. Absolutely. Yep. Thank you, Emily. Look, we have run out of time. Is there anything the panel wants to ask of the committee, the EUCG, or anything Lynn or any members need to add?
No, thank you. I'll leave anyone else last words. No.
I mean, we could continue this discussion, and that's something we might need to think about, given the breadth of this committee. We might need to think about the timing next year as well.
Yeah.
Can I just put one thing on the table and maybe catch up with some of these folks separately later on? When you mentioned Better Together initiatives, and I agree that it wasn't clear in the disclosures who was doing what and who was participating. And I'm wondering, after this discussion, are the Better Together initiatives the right initiatives, particularly for the coming 12 to 18 months? And what sort of line of sight have the EUCG and its members had on those Better Together initiatives in designing those and in identifying the priorities? It seems, and I could be wrong on this, it seems that the industry defined its own Better Together initiatives and said, this is what we think we should do, and then they've gone and done it without necessarily reaching out saying, okay, what are the top 5 things that consumers think that we should be working on?
Yep. And I guess in that context, I guess there was a desire to really want to move on all fronts, which is nice and aspirational, but there's limited consumer resources. And so we want to do the high impact, high value adding things and not everything. And so, you know, a number of organisations have contacted me and said either they aren't making their staff available or they're questioning why they're making their staff available to work on these things because there's something else they really need to be doing, So I do think some rationalisation, and I expressed my own personal view to Ben at the beginning of the year as well, pick the low-hanging fruit, well, in a different way. And what I mean is pick the things that are the most actionable and the most things you can demonstrate success and then keep building on that rather than a passionate embracing of every difficult problem that's been around for a while.
Lynn, and we've also have engaged in a discussion about with an ongoing opening up of engagement, consumer participation, you know, both at the signatory level, at the group level, at the Better Together level. There has to be a question about the resourcing of that capacity. It can't be the same number of people, the same smaller group of people to, you know, to be able to provide the kind of customer focused engagement that companies are saying they're committed to. So that is a key question. And if there, you know, anything further than any of you want to feed into the process on that issue about how to resource the engagement, I think that is something that we can't ignore. And also, I just, you know, do want to thank, you know, the commentaries about income adequacy have been noted, but also I do, you know, it is about really honing in on the measures that are entirely within signatories' control. Yes. And where there is very little debate that actually it will provide better protection than is currently in place. You know, so there are areas of grey and for debate, but there are, what we're looking for is the golden threads, I think, to say these things at least, these are the things that we would recommend are implemented now, you know, to take us next leap forward, as well as acknowledging processes. So the task force is an example that you've put forward to continue the work. But I don't think anybody underestimates. We have talked about, you know, the risks, Andrew, haven't we, around tsunami and Claire, of, you know, as other measures come off, what could be just around the corner. And as I think, Kelly, you noted about the debt levels, you know, there are some underlying indicators that people are going to be in big trouble if they're not presenting like that today. So
just on that as well, there's both a resourcing element to what I'm about to say too, and I don't want to take too much time, but I'll just put a marker down and for further discussion.
Before you say, Lynn, let me say I apologise as chair. I got the time wrong. We are booked to go through till 3:30, so we do have a few.
Okay, good. Okay. One of the things that's a strong feature in the US is working with, I'm trying to think what they actually call them. They might call them community service partners, and every utility has them. Every utility provides the opportunity for every customer of that utility to donate money to their community service partners. And those community service partners are actually then resourced as well, like Switched On Communities was in Queensland by AGL with a seed money or some money. And I really think we need to think about some of those longer term models as well, because this is going to be with us for a while. So, and while, you know, with all compliments to SAPN and what they're doing, we also need, you know, there's a force of, we have a lot of people who may actually be able to do a bit more volunteering at the moment, maybe, and work through those community service partners and actually help people with managing their bill, have people on the ground. You know, Vinnie's has both lost volunteers, but there are other people who've got more time. So thinking about a more medium term as well, way of really changing the way in which assistance or helping people in the community is delivered is really, I think we need to be more ambitious.
I mean, I think it's fair to say quite a number of the signatories have demonstrated expanding sort of relations that they're putting in place, various engagement mechanisms, which is something that Charter has, championed. Can I just, you're right, Claire, we've got a little bit more time, so can I just push on a bit with something that I think, Ross, you referred to around the risks around smart meters and the automation of processes and the risks inherent in that, with sort of drivers for greater efficiencies and for the access to technologies. The risk is that we're stripping out more and more human engagement, when actually in this area of essential services, human engagement is sometimes the most important thing. And I think a number of you talked about case management. So it would be great, and I've just been talking about Robodebt in an entirely different context, but potentially with the scale of what could happen, there are big risks there, with decisions being made which require very little human engagement. So I would like to hear from any of you about where you see the opportunities for technology and where you advances and where you are seeing that you would want to say there just has to be human engagement before an event occurs. Now, I've heard a little bit from you of going disconnections is one of them. And I just want to get a sense that that's a shared view, that you would not disconnect without having some proper human engagement. But the benefits of smart meters are discussed, but what are the risks there? Can you just expand a bit on that, Ross?
I think it's pretty explicit that, in fact, without the human in the middle, it's actually hard to bring that judgment, particularly human judgment that in fact is oriented to understanding the vulnerability and the circumstances. So if it's just someone who's actually going through their very bureaucratic process, then that's unlikely to result in the outcomes that we're looking for either. It's just that you hope that with a human you might be able to pull a string or two in that just jangles with them enough for them to shift a little in the way that they're thinking about stuff. You can't do that with a computer, or you can't do that with an automated system. So that's the thing, and that's that is the issue around all of this understanding about people's circumstances and understanding what makes them vulnerable, and understanding how easy it is for them to declare those vulnerabilities and describe them to people, because in lots of instances people may have a very hard time putting some of the things that make them very vulnerable out in a public conversation, whether that's the fact that they're sitting in a relationship where they're being beaten twice a day, or whether it's about shame about the fact that their partner just lost the house by gambling it away without them knowing. Those are things that you're not likely to easily want to reveal, even with human contact. And so there might even be some circumstances where having an interface that is a little less human might allow some of that stuff to emerge. So some people might feel a bit more comfortable writing something down in an email than they might actually having to have some of that personal conversation. So it's a very nuanced kind of thing, but the issue about the flick the switch is that there's no nuance in it at all. And there's no easy comeback from it. You don't have, with the switch flicked, who do you ring, and will they answer the phone within the first minute of your call? Will they actually take you seriously? Will they deal with it Probably not. Like all of the experiences that we have, whether it's robo-debt or some of our debt recovery processes that are in other places, point to the fact that people don't have access to that very quick redress. And so that makes it even more difficult for people to engage with those processes.
I guess that's great. I guess because earlier there was a comment about, for example, the automatically moving people onto best offer, and the ability to use big data to do predictive, assessment of vulnerability and being able to actively engage with people. So you are automating other aspects. Beneficial use of the technology and big data.
Yeah, absolutely. And why shouldn't people have access to those advantages? And why shouldn't energy companies be taking the opportunity to help their customers be advantaged? Because if their customers knew that, presumably they're going to be much more loyal and much more connected to them in the long run. They're not going to be looking to switch.
Thank you. Thanks, Ross. And I think that does go to a theme of our report about companies needing to be proactive rather than just continually that old reactive loop that has traditionally been the case, I think. Last comments. Anyone else?
I might just make a comment. So we've met with a few of the charter members, retailers throughout the pandemic. And I would just note when issues are raised with them, so we see a lot of people having poor experiences with their retailer through the National Debt Helpline. When issues are raised, it's often viewed as an outlier or something that the company is keen to address, but I guess not really accepted that this could be more of a systemic thing that the higher ups in those companies need to take on board and address. And I guess, related to Lynn's comments before about the ERGS grant in Victoria, we haven't seen the ESCV in Victoria change the rules at the start of October to try and get companies to help people fill out those forms and put them through to DHHS, but we haven't seen those numbers change, and we continue to get calls from people that have problems with them. So I see a bit of a disconnect between what is sometimes happening at the charter level and what we're hearing on the phone.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any other comments?
Just one more from me, and Ross, I think, mentioned it in the chat. I guess the other two things that we mentioned in our submission it goes to one of the principles in the charter, which is to support advocacy efforts on behalf of vulnerable consumers. And two of the biggest pieces of advocacy at the moment that would make a significant difference to vulnerable consumers is raising the rate and supporting more than 50 consumer groups in our advocacy around implementing energy efficiency for low income homes. And we have engaged with the Energy Charter members around both those advocacy points. And yes, there's been hesitation for them to support both those programs, but they would make a big difference to a lot of their consumers. And go to the principle in their charter that they would support advocacy on behalf of vulnerable consumers. So, we think they need to be stepping up in this case.
Thanks, Kelly. Anyone else? Lynn, did you have any final comments?
No, look, just thanks for a great discussion, and thanks to, again, I guess just to reiterate, the process is really time constrained and difficult for everybody to be able to contribute. So don't underestimate, I guess, the fact that we've been able to get so many people on the call and have put their thoughts together in the last little while. But I think it is valuable if it's worth going through the disclosures and you know, a year's worth of activity. It is worth having an opportunity for you know, good feedback and good listening. So even now, I think we probably haven't got it quite right in terms of this timing of the process. But even, you know, there's a scheduled discussion with the Energy Charter people, you know, early December, mid-December, and it's like, and then what? We're done. And also, it's not necessarily as inclusive. Well, no, that's actually probably not fair. The invite has gone more broadly, but you know, we're really asking people to find the time in a diary at a time of year and in circumstances, which is really quite tough for people to contribute. So I just want to thank everybody who's actually prioritised this as well.
Look, and let me add the panel's thanks to that as well. I mean, all my working life, I've been aware of the pressures on consumer advocates, and particularly in this area, when you look at the industry, the size and resources of the industry on the one hand, and the consumer representatives on the other, then it's a no contest, and everyone wants you to be on every customer committee and on every consultation. And you're right, you do have to think about high value, high impact, rather than just spreading too thinly. And we need to look at the charter process and also be part of that discussion. It can't be too long, obviously, so that we're always one step ahead. But it can't be too short either, because it just puts too much pressure. So that's something that we as a panel need to look at and also talk to the charter about, so that we can find a happy medium for all participants and not have too much pressure at this terrible time of the year. But that's for a discussion, absolutely.
And if I may add, Claire, you know, thank you to everybody for the participation. And because, as you know, in this context, I'm not here as ACOS CEO. I realised after I got on the call that I'm actually in the ACOS office. You might have noticed that, but I am here in my private capacity in this moment. And for the purposes of the panel process, I'm not directly involved in the ACOS submission. That is done by the acting CEO. So I am arm's length in this. I just want to say, though, I do think that, it will be in the spirit of the charter for us to, as we do a debrief over the process this time, for us to come back to a representative of the consumer groups or a checking off of the debrief to see that ultimately it actually does work for consumers to participate, because that is actually the charter in practice, isn't it, Claire? So I think we'll want to get some feedback from the charter signatories, but I think before we wrap up this particular round, it'll be great to get your kind of, so that we're essentially got an oversight of what the next process will look like before we complete this one. I think that's probably the best way to, and to, if it is about a cycle of change and getting that cycle right, the good thing is we've got this commitment that this is a cycle of change now, and we can do some more, you know, longer term planning around making the most of the other work you're doing, frankly, because I know you're in other meetings a lot. So,
yeah.
This is not the only time you raise these issues, that's for sure.
Certainly coming into it this year, everyone acknowledges that last year set the base, but this year with a prescribed number of pages for the disclosures instead of, War and Peace, it was much more focused, much more accessible. I think they can still be better, and we've had feedback from consumer groups about how do you really line them up against each other and assess the changes. All those sorts of things we've taken on board and we'll talk to the signatories about, so that we can continue to improve the process and make it much more accessible for the signatories, but particularly for the community as well. So they're all front of mind issues for us as we go into the third year.
That's terrific.
So
Thank you, everybody.
thank you, everyone. And yes, we do appreciate your time. That is a lot of time for people to give up at this time of the year. So thanks for the submissions and thank you for your time today. And we'll be talking again to you.
All right. And thanks to my team, as always, who've been gone above and beyond. Alex has read everything, watched everything. So it's fantastic.
Thanks, everyone.
Guinness Book of Records, Alex.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.